It's my pleasure to introduce for our third last lecture of this semester, President Tom Kunkel, who I regard and I think is widely regarded as a person of good humor, which gave me a lot of temptation as I thought about this introduction. But I like my job, so I decided there were just 3 points that I should perhaps make. Good call, he says. Yes. First, just for your information, most of us wouldn't be in a position to know. I'm aware that President Kunkel rearranged some travel, some college-related travel today to be able to be with us this morning. And to me, that's a testimony to his lived commitment to communio and to contemplation. And we're very grateful to see that in our leadership. Secondly, President Kunkel, or Pete Kunks, as I see him referred to on Facebook. Yes, and maybe in person.
I didn't say it myself.
No, I wasn't suggesting you made up the nickname. Anyway, I'm sure there's other cool, hip ways you refer to yourself. Yes, but no. See, I'm going down the slope already. It's trouble. Need to walk away really soon. Okay. Yeah. At any rate, President Kunkel regularly lends his ear to members of our community, and this is evidenced by any one of us who has experienced shooting him an email and hearing back within hours, moments perhaps, and knowing that our students as well have a direct line to hearing from the president of the college in sort of a stunning way that is a gift to us, I think. So it's fitting that today we turn things around and we lend him our ears as he shares his thoughts with us. And finally, I appreciate very much about President Kunkel that he holds in balance, I think, reverence and irreverence in a really graceful way, a trait that I admire both in writers and in leaders. So it's with deep gratitude and anticipation that we welcome St. Norbert College President Tom Kunkel to deliver today's last lecture.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Julie. Appreciate you coming out. Especially want to thank Julie for extending today's time frame to 2 hours to accommodate my lecture. So you better strap yourselves in there. Also, I want to congratulate Sarah and Joy for delivering 2 wonderful last lectures to start off this this series, and for virtually setting me up for failure here. So thank you for that. I do think it's a wonderful aspect to the Sacred Hour and the Common Prayer tradition here, and I'm very gratified to be asked to give a last lecture, the title of which is "The Legacy," or Talkin Bout My Generation. The recent passing of Steve Jobs called to mind something that happened to me last spring. My iPhone, which I love mostly, was suddenly acting up a bit, and I wondered if perhaps the battery was undergoing a digital version of pulmonary distress. So the next day I dropped by the ATT store to have it checked out. The 20-something clerk, of course dressed in black from head to toe, was nice enough, but only seemed about half paying attention as I handed him the phone and started reeling off the symptoms. He grunted, fixed on the appliance, but not on me. When was the last time you updated the operating system? He asked casually. Well, I thought for a moment. Well, never that I'm aware of, I replied. Well, he snapped too. Well, what do you mean, never? I mean, I don't know that I've ever updated it, I replied. How would I even know to do that? Well, what did you do when you got the operating system update messages on your iTunes, he asked. Well, nothing, I said. I don't use iTunes. Well, now I had his full attention. In fact, he was literally staring at me, apparently the only Apple consumer in history who doesn't download music. Apps either, for that matter. The poor kid's gobsmacked expression was that of an explorer who for years had heard stories of the Sasquatch, but had suddenly come face to face with one in the wild. Well, at last, trying to be helpful, I said, Well, since I got the phone, how many times have they updated the operating system? Just a minute, he said, fiddling with the interface as he sought the information, eyes widening all the while. He looked back at me. 18, he said. Well, I nodded and he nodded, and as we both realized that we had hit on the problem. After another awkward little pause, I said, probably not a good idea to start updating it now, I said. And no, he shrieked, no. His clear implication being that trying an 18 progressive update might cause it to spontaneously combust. Or as I preferred to imagine, it might simply seize up like the engine of my 76 Camaro that night Deb abandoned me on the Florida's Turnpike on the edge of the Everglades at 2 in the morning. But I suppose that's a topic for another last lecture. Where was I? Yes, Steve Jobs. Back to him in a minute. When you write books, it doesn't matter what you're working on. You're usually thinking about the 3 or 4 other ones that you'd like to be writing later on. One idea that I've had for a while now involves interviewing lots of people who were born in the same year I was, 1955. I would ask them what they think they contributed to make the world a better place. But maybe more important, I want to ask them about their regrets. How have we let successive generations down? What do they consider our collective missed opportunities, or our unreasonable expectations, or our failures of responsibility? After all, what generation in history has been given so much to work with? And at bottom, what have we done with that advantage beyond trying to acquire even more? As it happens, one of the people I'd have liked to interview was Steve Jobs, who was born on February 24th, 1955. By the way, as many of you know, the iWizard was adopted by a couple in California, but his birth mother was from Green Bay, and his birth father actually was a faculty member here at St. Norbert for several years in the late 50s. But that, again, I suppose, is a topic for another last lecture. Alas, it's too late to interview Steve Jobs. On the other hand, there are quite a few noteworthy people born in 1955 who are still with us. There's Chief Justice John Roberts, and another creative interpreter of law, former Attorney General Alberto Gonzales. There's Yo-Yo Ma and Maria Shriver and Bruce Willis, the writers John Grisham and Barbara Kingsolver, Kevin Costner and Whoopi Goldberg, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, and former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee. There's Hall of Fame Milwaukee brewer Robin Yount. There's the man who tried to kill President Reagan, John Hinckley Jr., born May 29, 1955. And Mark David Chapman, who assassinated John Lennon in Central Park, born May 10, 1955. And oh yes, Alfred E. Newman. What? Me worry? How's the world different for their having been here? How would it be different had there not been a Steve Jobs? Or a Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the World Wide Web, who was born on June 8, 1955. Or Bill Gates, born on October 28, 1955, about a month after I was. Apple, Microsoft, the Internet. I guess it's reasonable to say that my birth cohort has had a little something to do with the technological and digital revolution that has quite literally changed everything we know, from media to commerce to human socialization. But my generation played a role in many other watershed cultural and social developments as well. We furthered hard-fought gains in equality for women's rights and opportunities, for sexual identity, even for sexual freedom. We helped lift relations between races, which remains the great American dilemma, from the overt, nasty, and even legislated discrimination still so prevalent when we were young. We contributed to the transformation in communications, music, film, sport, and so many other aspects of popular culture. And of course, the advances in medicine we have experienced almost defy belief. By any measure, that's a litany of substantial progress. And yet, why am I not feeling more sanguine about the legacy of my generation? Well, because of another aspect of that legacy, the distinct possibility that perhaps for the first time in American history, the next generation, our children, will experience a quality of life inferior to our own, that we are foreclosing their opportunities just when they should be looking forward to them, that we have taken so much and left so little. Maybe it's because I'm a parent, or maybe it's because, like you, I work in higher education with all these inspiring young men and women, or maybe it's simply because I'm a concerned citizen. But I survey the messy, wobbly landscape that is America in the early 21st century, and I can't shake the feeling that we're off the path. In no small part, I believe, because we baby boomers have been pursuing some of the wrong things. Broken budgets, hateful and self-centered politics, a still compromised natural environment, atrophying public education, and unconscionable public debt. Our problems accumulate and begin to intertwine with one another like strands of Christmas lights, the very intercomplexity making the entirety of it seem almost beyond fixable, as if I'd asked my poor little iPhone to start churning through those 18 serial upgrades. But I guess the real question I have for my generation is this: having helped make this mess, what are we doing to fix it? Certainly we don't lack for ability or creativity. Let me expand my cohort ever so slightly to include those born a year before me, the class of 1954. That would add in the likes of musicians Elvis Costello, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and Adam Ant, film directors James Cameron, Ron Howard, and Michael Moore, the great Chicago Bear Walter Payton, Patty Hearst, Simpsons creator Matt Groening, Condoleezza Rice, the tragic Karen Ann Quinlan, Jerry Seinfeld, Al Sharpton, Justice Sonia Sotomayor, that paragon of humility, Larry Summers, John Travolta, Denzel Washington, Oprah Winfrey, Howard Stern, and Godzilla. Yes, a lot of talent was arriving at the tail end of the post-war baby boom. But so were new attitudes, and I fear therein lies the seed of the problem. For starters, a strain of entitlement runs through my generation like the Fox River. Not that that was the plan, of course. Still raw from the shock and deprivations of the Depression years and World War II, our parents were fiercely determined that we would have it better than they, that we would go further, and that we would profit from the unprecedented prosperity then emerging. And because of television and other media, we knew precisely what better was. As often as not, it meant what other people had. Thus was my generation the product of the most persistent social engineering in all of history, shaped alternately by our parents' bold hopes for us, by the natural opportunities opening to us, by the relentless marketing aimed at us, and by the miraculous things science was making possible, from space exploration to eradicating dread diseases. Clearly, we were living in a special age, and by logical extension, we came to believe we were special. Mom and Madison Avenue made the Kool-Aid, and we happily drank it. We came to expect we could have not only what we needed, but what we desired. It was quite literally our birthright, our entitlement. Not for nothing were we labeled the me generation. Now, hubris like that might be manageable, but unfortunately my generation also came of age in a period of tremendous cynicism. If you were born in 1955, the seminal event in your young life was the assassination of President Kennedy. Third and fourth graders had never even heard the word assassination before. We didn't know what innocence was either, but soon enough we realized we were losing it. Ours was an adolescence steeped in rock and roll, civil rights revolution, civil rights violence, rebellion, the burning of our cities, the sexual revolution, and the murder of two more icons, Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. We grew up with Vietnam, learning along the way that some wars are essentially unwinnable, and then staggered through Watergate. From roughly 1967 through 1973, it felt as if America's fabric was shredding and might never be mended. As a result, kids my age came to view every institution of authority, government, big industry, big religion, even higher education, in a highly cynical light, and not without reason. So there we were, children of cynicism on one hand and entitlement on the other. And what is entitlement really other than a fancy way of saying selfishness? Cynicism and selfishness, a particularly malign combination. You focus on yourself, then you talk yourself into believing that that's acceptable behavior, that in fact to do otherwise simply makes you a patsy. Now, as often happens in speeches about big subjects, I am using quite a broad brush here, I know. Of course, I realize that countless of my generation have led exemplary, even altruistic lives, despite everything I've said here. Just as I know there are countless others my age who never were permitted to share in the bounty in the first place. Nonetheless, I do believe that a collective selfishness has come to be a defining strain of my generation's character. Certainly it's easy to spot that underlying marker in so many of our contemporary ills. For all the miracles of modern medicine, our expectation that virtually any procedure, regardless how exotic or expensive, should be at our disposal is on the verge of bankrupting us. Meantime, we are nearly silent on another, better idea, that basic health care should be a universal human right. Similarly, Social Security, conceived essentially as a short-term safety net for the working classes, has somehow morphed in our minds into a bottomless ATM that affords us a right to retire for decades upon the backs of other people. Our political system long since stopped being about the true public good, if it ever was, and now blatantly revolves around what's best for individual and special interests. Our popular culture, in many ways a great and even democratizing gift to the world, increasingly is a toxic brew celebrating the self and the worst of our behavior. Nor is religion immune. Recent times have seen our faith institutions, including the Catholic Church, worrying more about protecting the powerful than the vulnerable, the needy, and the poor. If Christianity is fundamentally about compassion for others, it's been hard to find Christ in there lately. And we in education have much to answer for as well. As it became as ossified as any other American institution, the education industry evolved into too little about the students and too much about the educators and the institutions. But I think we've brought our special genius to the business environment. Needless to say, there have always been crimes and misdemeanors in business for as long as there's been business. But it seems to me what my generation's unique contribution here has been to reduce business to a bottom line number, a bloodless, sterile figure drained of all its underlying morality, ethicality, or even responsibility. I mean, after all, it's just a number. It doesn't have feelings or empathy or even a conscience. Such a rationalization makes it much easier to justify any means in the pursuit of the goal down to and including outright deception and fraud. Hey, I'm just trying to make my numbers. Several years ago, a fascinating lawsuit played out that for me symbolized how our priorities have so radically shifted in my time. In 1961, the heirs of the A&P grocery fortune gave Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public Policy and International Affairs an endowment of $35 million. The aim was to help send as many Princeton graduates as possible into the federal government, specifically to serve in foreign affairs. By 2004, that endowment had grown to a staggering $600 million and was the major piston propelling the Wilson School. But by then, only 7% of the Wilson grads were heading off to Washington in the Foreign Service. Far more of them, their tuition essentially covered by the endowment, mind you, were bound for Wall Street, consulting firms, or the law. And I dare say the same has been true of most other top public policy schools. So the A&P heirs sued Princeton to get their money back, all $600 million of it, in order to give it to other institutions more in tune with their thinking. The suit was eventually settled with Princeton ceding a big chunk of the endowment back to the family. But the larger point is this. In the span of just 4 decades, the legions of the best and brightest that John Kennedy so successfully summoned to public service were instead focused more intently on their own bottom line. Let's widen out my cohort a little further yet, to the other side of my birth year, to the babies of 1956. Michelle Bachmann, Larry Bird, disgraced former Illinois governor, is that a quadruple oxymoron? Rod Blagojevich, and disgraced Minister Ted Haggard, Bo Derek, Mel Gibson, Tom Hanks, Joe Montana and Martina Navratilova, David Copperfield, Claudia Schiffer's, not Charles Dickens's, satirist Bill Maher, satirist David Sedaris, Dwight Yoakam, Paul Azan and Ann Curry, the other Mr. Brewer, Paul Molitor. So what do we expect them, us, me, to do about this state of affairs? Please understand that I am not blaming my age mates for all the world's ills. But given the talent represented just in the 3 cohorts that I've listed earlier, can we not be doing more to ameliorate them? Of course, the question is how. That would probably take a lecture from someone much smarter than I am. However, I do know that, as with any instance that requires changed behavior, the first thing we must do is acknowledge the severity of the issue and then resolve, truly resolve, to do better. Or as our kids like to remind us, we've got to get over ourselves. In that vein, then, let me offer a few modest observations to start squeezing the me out of the me generation. Too many of the behaviors I've outlined earlier are, to put it bluntly, immoral. And we need to start talking about them in those terms. Crushing the poor, consolidating the wealth, duping the naive, or mocking the less fortunate cannot be squared in any way with whatever faith you say you embrace. At the very least, let's get hypocrisy off the list of our failings. We must acknowledge that our sense of entitlements has in fact outstripped our willingness to pay for them. As individuals and as a nation, we've got to make adjustments, take responsibility, and pay our own bills. None of us present in this hall would rob our children or grandchildren of tens of thousands of dollars. Why would it somehow be permissible to, in effect, take that same amount of money from our neighbors' children? Stop blaming political leaders for failing to lead and recognize they are only doing what we've trained them to do, protecting those who protect them. If we truly want politicians to govern in the best interests of all, we have to back it up with our own priorities. We have to stop talking about shared sacrifice and start actually engaging in some. Enjoy what you've earned by all means, but don't forget there were many reasons beyond your own brilliance that you have it. And spread more of your good fortune around. Remember that what we tell our students every semester: to whom much is given, much is expected. Finally, understand that we can't have it all. We can't live forever. We can't have six-pack abs and an AARP card. Well, some of us can. We can't take it with us. And we can't have sex until we're 93 just because we're popping Cialis. Besides, as I understand it, that particular medication requires outdoor bathtubs. Which puts we Wisconsinites at a distinct disadvantage. Well, I've been hard on my fellow baby boomers, but I don't want my disappointment to suggest there is no hope, because there is always hope. In fact, to underline that truth, let me close with the man who created my iPhone and so many other modern-day miracles. Despite his conspicuous gifts and talents, Steve Jobs was by all accounts very much a product of his generation, with many of its worst impulses. He could be a bully or worse. He was driven by ambition, success, and not occasionally revenge. The world revolved around him, and he often took pains to let the world know it. And yet, his fundamental character was sound enough and his heart expansive enough that he surmounted these shortcomings. At his core, he was driven to make the world a better, more efficient, more beautiful, and more fun place. And by the way, he did not find such sentiments corny. He considered them a mission statement. Jobs' sister is the writer Mona Simpson, who grew up with a single mom in Green Bay and went on to write the bestseller Anywhere But Here, a fact that in itself could be the topic of yet one more last lecture. Anyway, in a moving eulogy for her brother, she revealed that on his hospital deathbed, Steve Jobs' last words were, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." Now I know at first that sounds a little bit like a Steve Jobs parody. But when you really think about those words being uttered by a dying man, they could be about anything: pain, shock, fear, awe, even disappointment. But I suspect that in Steve Jobs' case, it wasn't a lament about the things left undone. Rather, I hope it belied an awareness on his part of the surpassing joy awaiting him on the other side of the ultimate portal, his having done as much as he possibly could for all the people he was leaving behind. I think that is a legacy any one of us, whatever your age, would take. Thank you very much.